What is a part of history that we consider to be a fact is 100% fake. Corsets were not typically tight-laced. They were only tight-laced by the highly fashionable women, and usually only for particular events or portraits. Corsets were designed to be comfortable. Women wore a cotton layer underneath the corset, so it didn't rub against the skin. The corset was more like a bra, but instead of using the shoulders to support it used the whole torso. Some people claim they are much more comfortable than modern bras. The intense proportions of the past were achieved with corsets and padding. Tight lacing was uncommon, but layers of petticoats or hoops or bum rolls, or whatever else at the time was very common to give women the trendy body shape at the time. Thank you for this. I commented about corsets but I'm lazy and didn't go into details. Also nice to point out, the boning was never extremely rigid as it seems. Spiraled metal and whale bones were used, and they are quite flexible. Stays were quite rigid, but no sane woman would tight-lace a stay. Also considering that they used to be tied as in spiral, not in a cross pattern as we see today. The image of Roman gladiators fighting to the death. While there were many exhibition fights in the arenas where the goal was death, these were not gladiator contests. Prisoners, and the condemned, were thrown out to fight to the death, but not real gladiators. Training a gladiator was an expensive, and lengthy, investment, and having them die constantly would be bad for business. If a gladiator ended up dying in the arena, the guy who sponsored the games would have to reimburse the gladiator's school. It was really more like choreographed combat than anything. Gladiators practiced spectacular but useless moves to make the crowd gasp. There's a very thorough and interesting display in the Roman amphitheater in Nîmes, France that dispels a lot of these myths. Gladiators were sport heroes. They would travel and put on shows. They were paid well and taken good care of. That the Spanish Armada was destroyed. They did lose 44 ships out of 137. And the British also didn't beat them off with a small force. Their navy was actually significantly larger with 197 ships since they were joined by the Dutch Republic. A decisive defeat? Yes. A small English force overcoming and obliterating the might of the entire Spanish and Portuguese navy? No. Wasn't a good chunk of the Armada destroyed by storms before they made land? Yes, most of the Armada wasn't lost to enemy action. It was lost to the storms in the North Sea and along the Irish coast. And the weather conditions helped. Ned Kelly's last words being "such is life." That was made up by the reporter. So many Aussies have it tattooed or have big stickers on their 4x4s. But I guess "oh well" doesn't have the same ring to it. I like "oh well, lol." I also find it weird/hilarious/sad that that's what he's known for instead of being known for being the only person to have served as both President and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Paul Revere did not run around Massachusetts shouting, "The British are coming," because, if he did, everyone would look at him like he'd lost his mind. Almost everyone in the colonies was British. He actually said, "The regulars are coming." The lore I was taught growing up was that, "the redcoats are coming." Chiming in to say was also taught, it was, "the redcoats are coming." He also only carried that message for a small stretch of the ride. There were about a half-dozen messengers passing it along. We remember Paul Revere as the only rider because, no joke, his name fit best in Longfellow's poem. Longfellow, not Irving. It should be called The Midnight Ride of Dr. Samuel Prescott. The lady who sued McDonald's didn't do so frivolously. She received third-degree burns from how hot that coffee was, and needed a skin graft. It was quickly found that that location was keeping the coffee well above the temperature you can legally serve a hot drink in a cup at. The fact that most people think this suit was over the temperature of the coffee, and not the debilitating burns that woman received, is one of the PR world's greatest triumphs. You are not immune to propaganda. It was actually found that McDonald's had all of their locations keeping coffee temps too hot. Multiple reports of burns were placed before the main incident, and were just settled out of court and ignored by the corp. The poor woman just wanted enough money to cover her medical bills, and nothing more originally. Yeah, I think the coffee was kept at near boiling temperature. Been a long time since I looked it up, and don't want to now because of the NSFL factor, but I believe the lady's genitals were melted/partially fused. Needed reconstructive surgery along with the aforementioned skin grafts. Horrific stuff. We actually learned about this at my middle school, as a kind of cautionary tale about rushing to judgment, and taking things at face value. It was first presented to us like, a woman spilled McDonald's coffee on herself, and sued the company for millions of dollars. Discuss whether you think she was in the right, and of course everyone was adamant that it was a frivolous lawsuit, and that someone shouldn't win millions of dollars for spilling coffee. I could just go to McDonald's, dump some coffee on myself, and become a millionaire? That's so stupid. Then we were told how hot the coffee was, and shown slides of blurred images of the burns she received, and how the coffee had basically melted her flesh. Oh, we all thought. Maybe she was justified. We then had to discuss whether/how this new information changed our views. There's a few more things about this case. This happened around the same time big businesses were astroturfing hard for tort reform. They paid big money to have this story misrepresented in the media, and used it as an example why it should be more difficult for people to sue for injury as a result of things like negligence and misconduct. Nearly every U.S. media outlet picked up the astroturf narrative and ran with it. McDonald's knew the serving temperature was dangerous, they knew people were getting injured, and they kept on doing it because the higher temp made the store more aromatic, and drove coffee sales. She sued for medical expenses. The jury knew that McDonald's was being intentionally negligent, and awarded her punitive damages far exceeding what she asked in order to punish McDonald's. General public not being aware that classical Greece and Rome had colored paints all over those statues, much less colored dyes in their clothes. Point being, we tend to believe that there was a lot of white in the classical period, which isn't actually the case. Related to Rome, gladiators used to advertise for local blacksmiths, who provided them armor and weapons. Ridley Scott intended to portray this in Gladiator, but left it out because he felt people wouldn't believe it. This battle was brought to you by Incurso Umbra Legere. Are you not entertained? Because the armor today is brought to you by the finest of blacksmiths from Raid Shadow Legends. Use my promo code XVIXIVIVSHIVIVIVING for 14% off. What the hell kind of promo code gives 14% off? A lot of people's weird misconceptions about ancient culture are completely founded in not fully understanding and appreciating that biologically they were 100% us. Take anyone in your town and plop them 2,500 years ago, and aside from style and ethnicity, they'd fit right in and have the same brain. They'd probably be panicking and unable to communicate, sure, lol, but human thinking capacity? Yeah, completely there. Just hear so much, why didn't they, oh wow, how did they manage that without modern engineers and machines? That sort of stuff. Most ancient civilizations had engineers, they had promoters, they had conmen and doctors and barbers, and everything that addressed problems that people had. And their culture and education level impacted that, but it was all there. As soon as the capacity was, it existed in people. Just rambling, I guess, it's something I bump into a lot. Kidnap one of their babies, enroll them in a school alongside modern kids, and in a few years nobody would be able to tell the difference. The Tiffany problem or effect or some other word. People think some things are distinctly modern, and it seems out of place when it is correctly portrayed in ancient times. Like the name Tiffany being ancient. Or pronouncing the final R. Every show in a medieval setting, or fake medieval, like Game of Thrones, uses some sort of modern British accent that drops the final R, but they did pronounce it back then. The Chinese terracotta army was also originally painted. Yep, upon unearthing them it destroyed the paint almost immediately. What's crazy is that it's only one of many still buried pits that surround Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum. The mausoleum itself is underground, and looks like a big hill since it's a pyramid. Until foolproof methods for preservation are figured out, it'll likely remain unexcavated. But there's something of a debate because it's in a region with high seismic activity, and by leaving it as is there's a risk everything could be destroyed by an earthquake, so it may be better to take the risk of losing some preservation to save the whole, and add that knowledge. There are also highly toxic levels of mercury within the pits. The story goes that the original designers of the tomb created a map of China using mercury to represent all of China's major rivers. Supposedly a mechanical mean kept the mercury flowing constantly. Whether that's true or not, the tomb itself is highly toxic and requires special methods to exhume in order to keep explorers safe. Not just the statues, but the buildings too. The Parthenon would have been very colorful. And the Egyptian temples. Every so often on one of the temples you see some remains of paint on the hieroglyphics, which survived the elements. The Great Pyramids were covered in bright white limestone, and had a metallic cap at the top, that would have shone brightly in the sun. The traditional image of Socrates lecturing in a white toga is all wrong, it should actually be tie-dyed. Now I imagine Socrates looking all hippie-like with a ponytail, round glasses and tie-dyed togas. I'm telling you man, the only true wisdom is like, in knowing you know nothing dude. The ancient Greeks and Romans used opium, marijuana, and other narcotics to relieve pain and induce sleep. They may have also enhanced rituals and enlivened banquets with hallucinogens. Well, you never know. Same for castles. Things medieval TV and film annoy me as they always seem to have bare stone walls, but they would have been very flashy. The White Tower at the Tower of London is called that because it was painted white, with red roses on it too at some points. And same for medieval churches and cathedrals. The colors used have been recovered in some cases either by analyzing the stone, or by finding fresco panels under later whitewashing, or behind altar wooden panels. Lots of stories painted in walls, and decorated pillars. Sainte-Chapelle in Paris gives you an example for Gothic, and if you check Byzantine mosaics, example, Venezia St. Mark, and imagine them translated to paint, you have the Romantic, with style changes of course. Ninjas dressed in all black to stay stealthy in the night or something like that. Ninjas dressed like normal people to blend in. The all-black look stemmed from Japanese theater to make it more obvious to the audience who the ninjas were. If they wore all black it'd be quite obvious, and they'd stick out like a sore thumb. Most of you pointed out it also came from stagehands. That makes a lot of sense too. Of course they didn't wear all black, there were red, white, blue and later even green ninjas. Up, kick back, whip around and spin. Also shuriken got used less as actual weapons and more like a dangerous distraction. And while we're at it, samurai weren't particularly honorable, and fought mostly with bows, and spears with katanas only being the third weapon of choice. Or like, guns. LOL. I read the Book of Five Rings as a teenager while in a samurai movie phase, which is kinda a manual for samurai from the 1600s. It encourages carrying a flintlock pistol, or two so you can just shoot people without having to fight them. Look up the Battle of Nagashino sometime. It was a thoroughly decisive battle, and clearly showed that the flintlock, matchlock, I think, was going to be a deciding factor in war moving forward. Tokugawa Ieyasu consolidated power in Japan just 25 years later at the Battle of Sekigahara, where guns again played an important role. Also, this idea of honor is weirdly skewed. The way that we think of honor really doesn't apply to the way that people lived in feudal Japan. Archery and spears weren't dishonorable by any stretch of the imagination. Minamoto no Tamatomo is purported to have been a legendarily powerful archer. Japan began to idealize their own warrior class during a long span of peace. What happens when you have a rigid class system but the entire island is united? You end up with 40 years men who were raised from birth to be warriors but never saw battle, and were basically just town guards, so began to idealize combat, and that a samurai would never surrender or retreat. When we have letters showing actual warring samurai had casually reported that a fight was going badly and retreated, there was no indication that they had dishonored themselves in doing so. Wasn't it that the all-black look was worn by the people moving the props in Japanese theater? And then in some plays there was a twist, that one of those prop holders attacked the protagonist? That's what I was led to believe. Because they were unseen, people mistake ninjas wearing that, when they were in reality unseen, because they blended in with people wearing normal things, not the background of a stage production. Einstein never failed math. The rumor started from Ripley's Believe It or Not, and Einstein actually responded to them saying, "I never failed in mathematics. Before I was 15 I had mastered differential and integral calculus." He wasn't very good at the non-science related classes though, and did fail French. I'm so confused about Einstein and Ripley's Believe It or Not existing at the same time. Well, Einstein died in 1955. He saw Looney Tunes cartoons and probably heard rock and roll. He was born just 8 years after the start of the German Empire, and witnessed all that lost civilization's history. He briefly lived in the same time as Wagner. Bismarck was the chancellor through his childhood. He obtained his PhD in 1905 and became director of Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physics. And rock and roll became popular due to a movie that premiered 2 weeks before his passing. He may yet have listened to rock and roll on the radio. It's one of history's mysteries. But still, to live from Wagner to rock. You think that is freaky? There was a 22-year window in which a samurai could have sent a fax to Abraham Lincoln. The original fax machine prototype was invented in 1843. Abraham Lincoln lived from 1809 to 1865. The last samurai died in 1877. It's legit. Ripley's Believe It or Not actually started December 19, 1918. It's weird to think, but it's over 100 years old. Believe it or not. FFS, that shit ended up being portrayed on Star Trek TNG, when Data played poker with him. Sir Isaac Newton ended up making fun of him for not being able to do simple arithmetic, because AE couldn't figure out what the bet was. If that's how the hologram was programmed, that's how it acted. Garbage in, garbage out. People got confused by the different grading scales. That Einstein said, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, and expecting different results. The Boston Tea Party didn't have some grand celebration. A lot of the colonists were confused, and it's recorded as one of Boston's most quiet nights. It's also worth noting that the spark that ignited the Boston Tea Party wasn't a grand protest about taxation without representation. In reality, it was done as retaliation, as British Parliament gave the okay for East India Trading Co. to sell surplus tea directly to the colonies as a cost-cutting measure, to prevent East India from going bankrupt. Up until the Tea Act of 1773, East India had a pretty cushy setup. They would sell the tea they made at Dutch auction, since the Dutch had no taxes on imported tea, get the British government to cover the duty cost of doing so, then have merchants import the tea back to their native countries/colonies paying full tax in the process. Due to external factors, including smuggling rings, the Bengal famine of 1770, and the expiration of the Indemnity Act of 1767, the East India Trading Company began hemorrhaging money on the entire arrangement. With the decline of sales from official East India tea, and the rise of smuggled tea entering Great Britain, East India was on the brink of bankruptcy. New legislation limited the amount that Parliament was willing to cover for duty, and after failing to come to better agreements, it was eventually decided that in order to save East India, Parliament would allow them to sell directly to colonies as a way to save cost. And as it turned out, it saved a significant amount of money on importing tea, to the point where East India could afford to undercut smugglers in most places, and still turn some level of profit. This also opened up East India to sell to the American colonies directly. It's this move that pissed off the Sons of Liberty. They were already a political group parading themselves as anti-loyalist, who happened to be composed primarily of smugglers and governing officials, who had direct ties in the smuggled tea trade. So when East India came knocking with tea cheap enough to undercut the smugglers, and screwing over local colonial importers, they got pissed. With enough vocal support behind the taxation without representation movement, they spun the story of East India opening shop in American colonies as just another extension of the British government levying heavy tax on imported goods that lined their own pockets instead of going back to the colonies. Granted, there were other important factors still at play here. Legitimate and law-abiding importers that didn't sign on with East India directly were posed to lose a lot as a result of this ordeal, and it would effectively cement East India as a true monopoly of the tea trade, backed in some capacity by the British government directly, which opened up a very real threat that other commodities on the market could face a similar fate. Plus the real sentiment that this was a decision made by the British government, with no input from the colonies, was enough to hard-wire sentiment against the proposal. In history classes, we were always taught the idea of the Boston Tea Party as being some grand protest in the face of Big Bad Britain levying higher taxes on essential goods including tea, and other imported goods. But in reality it was a bunch of politicians and their rich smuggler friends retaliating against a market force that threatened to undercut their grey market business. Almost everything about the medieval times. Our image of it is highly influenced by Hollywood. Plug for the podcast, we're not so different with deep dives on nearly every aspect of medieval society by Eleanor Janega, Ph.D. who specializes in the period. Fascinating stuff. So many people completely misunderstand pre-industrial lifespans. The average age of death was 30 not because our bodies wore out faster, but because of how averages are calculated. A lot of people died as children. A much larger chunk of the population died in wars. If you got in an accident, healing without modern medicine was difficult. But for people who reached adulthood, and then avoided violence, injury, and plague, living to be 60 or 70 was pretty normal. That people used swords and axes all the time. Spears. It's spears, most of human history has been spears. Vikings used spears, samurai and knights used spears. Hell, bayonets exist because people felt you always need a spear, even with a rifle in your hand. William Blake said, "When the stars threw down their spears, slash and watered heaven with their tears." Which is stupid. No one throws down their spear. Spears are great for poking people to death. Combat is all about hitting a person without being hit yourself. It's why we have been developing stuff to hit each other from further and further away. A sniper rifle is just like a really long spear. The invention of archery was based on, I really want to stab that guy, but he's all the way over there. Marie Antoinette saying, "Let them eat cake." Although as I recall weren't her last words actually an apology to her executioner for tripping over his foot. Yep. Then he chopped off her hair to sell as souvenirs. I know that in the US, as late as the 20th century, the same thing would happen to people who were lynched. You'd see knuckles, fingers, toes in store windows the next day. The community would come out and bring their cameras. They'd send pictures of the lynchings in the mail as postcards to their relatives. It would be publicized in the news and people from all over would visit to see it. People would brutalize the person being lynched before, during, and after the lynching. They would set them on fire, beat them, cut them. And, once they finished, take body parts as souvenirs, to keep or sell. The victims of this brutality were almost always black, and were killed specifically because of their skin color. Many committed no crime at all. For instance, this is what happened to Mary Turner, who was 19 years old and 8 months pregnant, in 1918. A mob hung her upside down from a tree, doused her in gasoline and motor oil, and set her on fire. While Turner was still alive, a member of the mob split her abdomen open with a knife. Her unborn child fell on the ground, where it cried before it was stomped on and crushed. The mob then shot hundreds of bullets into her body. Mary's crime was speaking out to defend her husband from accusations of murder after he was lynched. Her lynching was one of more than a dozen, that happened all to try to find the murderer of one man. May 1918 lynchings. A sad little addition to your story. I live in the Georgia county in which Mary Turner was lynched. The only sort of memorial that exists for her is one single metal sign with a brief description of her story. It's regularly riddled with bullet holes, and they don't care to replace it very often. Don't know if this really means anything, but the sign is in an area that good old boys, mostly teens, go to play with their guns anyway. So lots of the surrounding trees, and other nearby stuff become targets as well. But still, why the sign? Very disrespectful. This is a little niche, but it's been a long-held belief in the gaming community, that one of Nintendo's business ventures before getting into the video game market was love hotels, hourly hotels whose main purpose is to knock boots in. This has been repeated as fact alongside their other historical ventures like playing cards, taxis, instant food, and toys. But last year a Nintendo enthusiast did a dive into their historical financial records, and found no definitive proof that they ever ran or were associated with love hotels in any way. Thanks for watching this video. Hit the bell next to subscribe so you never miss a video. Like, comment and subscribe if you are new on the channel.